I have been a ward nurse for 11 years. I have seen things that don't appear in the standard curriculum. A Velsorath soldier with his sternum replaced by a ceramic plate still breathing through a punctured lung. A Kareth diplomat whose secondary heart had migrated 2 full centimeters from its baseline position during a decade of stress-induced hypertension. A child from the outer colonies whose nervous system had wired around a spinal lesion so efficiently that 3 senior diagnosticians had argued for an hour about whether the lesion had ever been there at all. I am not easily surprised by biology. I have learned to treat the body as a complicated machine and to approach every deviation from baseline with the same flat professional attention. Note it, measure it, report it, proceed. I tell you this because what I am about to describe is not something I could have invented. I have thought about it carefully, many times in the months since it happened. There is no version of the events that I find more comfortable than the true one. So I will tell you exactly what I observed, in the order I observed it, and I will let you form your own conclusions. My conclusions are already formed. They have not changed. His name was Dale Marsh. He came in on the evening of the 14th day of the 3rd standard month, brought by a compact transit authority medic who had found him on the loading dock of Bay 19 with blunt trauma injuries to the left side and a laceration across the orbital ridge that had bled considerably. He was conscious. He was cooperative. He answered every intake question in a steady voice and did not complain about the wait, which was 40 minutes because we had 2 simultaneous Velinari vascular events ahead of him on the triage board, and I was the only senior nurse on the isolation wing that evening. When I finally got to him, he was sitting on the edge of the intake bench with his hands folded in his lap, watching the corridor the way a man watches a corridor when he has spent time in places where corridors needed watching. He was broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with several days of growth on his jaw, and a set of hands that were calloused across the knuckles in a pattern I had not seen before. Human, clearly, the coloring, the proportions, the particular way the skin sat over the orbital ridge. 35 to 40 years old by my estimate. Later, I learned he was 38. Dale Marsh, I said, reading from the transit medic's transfer note. That's right, his voice was unhurried. The kind of voice that has decided it is not going to waste energy on anything it doesn't need to. I'm Nurse Rin. I'll be running your intake assessment. Can you tell me what happened? He told me. He had been supervising the unloading of a cargo transfer in Bay 19 when a hydraulic coupling on the secondary gantry had failed. A section of loading equipment. He described it with the precise practical vocabulary of someone who had worked around machinery for years, had swung loose on its mount and struck him across the left side before he could clear the area. He had gotten his arm up in time to protect his head, which was how he had taken the impact across the ribs and the shoulder rather than across the skull. The orbital laceration, I asked. Caught the corner of a deck panel on the way down. He said it without drama. I didn't lose consciousness. I noted that. I noted also that he had not once in that account expressed any annoyance, not at the equipment failure, not at the 40-minute wait, not at me. He watched me write his answers down and waited to be asked the next question. It was the most cooperative intake I had run in several weeks. Do you have any listed medical conditions, prior surgeries, implants or prosthetics? No to all 3, he said. Previous injuries requiring medical care. He thought for a moment. A compound fracture of the right radius 6 years ago, a deep laceration to the left thigh 9 years ago requiring surgical closure. Concussive injury 11 years ago. I was cleared for duty 36 hours later, which the medic said was faster than it should have been. A brief pause. Various other minor injuries over the years. Military service. He looked at me, not with suspicion, just with the attention of someone recalibrating how thorough I was going to be. 12 years in the compact infantry, 4 years deployment, 8 years installation support, Left 18 months ago. Any ongoing medical monitoring from the compact military medical division? No, I was cleared clean at separation and released from monitoring. I noted it all. None of it constituted a flag clinically. Veterans with his service profile were not unusual in the patient population, and the injuries he had described, the radius fracture, the thigh laceration, the concussion, were within normal range for someone with his service record. The comment about the concussion clearing faster than expected was interesting enough that I noted it, but not interesting enough to change my assessment of what I was looking at. A man in his late 30s with blunt trauma injuries sustained in a workplace accident, in need of imaging, closure work on the orbital laceration, and pain management. His initial assessment showed what I expected. 2 fractured ribs on the left side, significant soft tissue bruising across the thoracic wall, the orbital laceration which was deep but clean, and periarticular swelling around the left shoulder, joint consistent with the impact he had described. Painful injuries, all of them, not life-threatening. I irrigated the laceration and applied a regenerative closure strip, gave him a standard analgesic infusion at the dosage calibrated for human patients, and ran the baseline bioscan that protocol requires for all human admissions to ORATH 7, a formality mostly. Humans are unusual patients here. The station serves primarily Velinari and Karath populations, with occasional Velsorath transit patients. We see perhaps 2 or 3 human patients per standard month. The baseline bioscan takes 3 hours for a full-spectrum reading. I logged Dale Marsh into Observation Bay 4, explained that the scan would complete overnight and that I would check on him at the 2-hour mark, and went back to the rest of the wing. He had not asked me for anything beyond what was clinically offered. He had not asked how long he would be there, or whether he could have visitors, or whether the station's patient entertainment system worked in the isolation wing. He had said thank you when I applied the closure strip, quietly, as a thing he meant rather than a social reflex, and had settled back against the pillow of the observation bay with the same patient stillness he had brought to everything else. I thought about that briefly as I went back to the corridor. It is not unusual for patients to be cooperative in intake. What was slightly unusual was the quality of his cooperation, not the performance of compliance, not the careful helpfulness of someone who wants to be discharged quickly and has decided that cooperating is the strategy for achieving that. He was cooperative the way someone is cooperative when they have genuinely decided that the person in front of them is doing a job that deserves their respect, and that the best thing they can do is make that job easier. There was a distinction, and I noticed it, and I filed it away. At the 2-hour mark, I came in and found him awake. He was not looking at the scan display above the bed, which most patients watch compulsively, tracking every number with the anxious attention of someone who is trying to understand a language they were never taught. He was looking at the ceiling, with the same quality of settled attention he had directed at the corridor during intake. His hands were folded across his abdomen. His breathing was slow and measured. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Better than I expected, honestly," he said. "The ribs are still registering, but the shoulders quieted down a lot." The shoulder swelling had responded well to the anti-inflammatory component in the analgesic infusion. That was normal and not remarkable. I glanced at the scan display to check the rib status and the soft tissue inflammation index. The numbers made me stop. Not dramatically, not in the way that makes a nurse step back or call for a consult mid-shift. I stop the way I stop when I am reading a chart and I find a number that doesn't immediately match my expectation, and I need a moment to verify that I am reading it correctly. The soft tissue inflammation index was lower than the baseline I had recorded 2 hours earlier. Soft tissue inflammation after a blunt trauma impact of that magnitude typically plateaus for 6 to 8 hours before the body's repair mechanisms begin making measurable progress. He was 2 hours post-intake. The index should have been holding steady at baseline or climbing slightly as bruised tissue continued to respond to the injury event. This was standard physiology, and it held across species with only minor variation in the specific timeline. His index was falling. I checked the equipment calibration. It was fine. I checked whether the analgesic infusion had an anti-inflammatory component strong enough to account for the reading. It didn't. The human-compatible formulation we use is calibrated to manage pain with minimal interference in the inflammatory cascade, because that cascade is part of the body's own repair signaling, and we do not want to suppress it wholesale. I checked whether I had logged the baseline incorrectly. I had not. "Are you in significant pain?" I asked him. "Some," he said, "manageable." I made a note in the chart. Possible calibration artifact. Recheck at 4-hour mark, and I went back to the corridor. I am methodical. When a reading deviates from expectation, the first step is to question the tool, not the patient. At 4 hours, the inflammation index had fallen further, by a margin that I had to read twice. I stood at the display panel in the corridor outside Bay 4 for a long moment, looking at the numbers and then looking at the overnight bioscan running in the background, and then looking at the numbers again. Then I went into Bay 4. He was still awake, reading now, a small personal data card he must have had in his jacket pocket. He looked up when I came in, without the startled quality people often have when they are read deep in something and pulled out of it. He came back to the room the way he did everything else, easily, without friction. "More checks?" he asked. "I'd like to run a secondary scan if you're agreeable," I said. "The inflammation readings are showing something I want to verify." "Go ahead," he said, and set the data card down. "Is something wrong?" "Not clinically," I said, because that was true. His pain was managed, his vitals were stable, and the inflammation falling was not, in itself, a symptom I needed to treat. The readings are simply outside my baseline expectation. I'd like to verify them with a second instrument. He nodded. In the easy way he agreed to everything, not because he was incapable of pushing back, I thought, but because he had assessed the situation and found that the request was reasonable and the person making it was trustworthy. Those were separate calculations for him. I could see the distinction in the way he made them. The secondary scan matched the primary. The inflammation index was not a calibration error. It was a real reading, and it was continuing to fall. I wrote up a full deviation report, flagged it for the morning senior diagnostician, and went home. I am methodical, and the methodical thing was to follow the protocol, document the deviation, flag it for qualified review, and not speculate beyond what the data showed. The data showed accelerated soft tissue recovery. That was all I could say with confidence at the 4-hour mark. What I could not say with confidence, and what I thought about on the transit home, and while I made my evening meal and before I fell asleep, was whether the deviation was contained to the soft tissue or whether it was part of something larger. The instinct of an 11-year nurse is not always a clinical tool, but it is not nothing either. Something was happening in Bay 4 that I did not have a category for. I did not know its edges. I did not know its direction. I knew, in the way I sometimes know things before the data has caught up with the knowing, that the morning scan was going to show me something worth being awake for. I was not wrong. The senior diagnostician's name was Havel On. He was a careful, precise man who had been practicing diagnostic medicine for 30 years and whose professional approach was similar to mine in its commitment to methodical process, though his tolerance for things he couldn't immediately categorize was, in my estimation, somewhat lower. He called me before I had reached the transit hub the following morning. "Your overnight flag on the human patient in Bay 4, he said, without preamble. "Yes." I ran the morning scan at 600. His soft tissue inflammation index is down 63% from the baseline you logged at intake. 63% in 14 hours. I stopped walking and did the arithmetic. The fracture sites. There was a pause on the line that told me the answer before he said it. Active calcification at both break sites, Havel said, and his voice had the precise flatness of a man maintaining professional composure by force of practice. Left second rib and left third rib, both sites. Measurable, confirmed, not an artifact. I ran the verification sequence twice. Another pause. In 14 hours. What are the density readings? He read them to me. I stood in the transit corridor and did the arithmetic again, and then I stopped pretending I could finish the calculation in my head and asked him to send the numbers to my personal display so I could look at them properly. Human rib fracture calcification under standard conditions is a 4 to 6 week process. The density readings Havel had given me corresponded to a repair timeline that, by every standard reference I carried in my head from 11 years in the ward, should have required weeks, not hours. He's resting comfortably, Havel said. No fever within human baseline norms, no anomalous neurological presentation, no signs of pain beyond what he described as manageable last evening. He was awake when I came in at 600. And he asked if he was allowed to have 2 cups of the morning protein infusion. What did you tell him? I told him yes. The pause again. I've escalated to Director Morin. She arrived at 7:15. I thanked him and went to the station faster than I usually walk. Director Seth Morin ran the Medical Research Division of ORATH 7 alongside her administrative role, and she had a way of conducting herself in a patient space that was the professional equivalent of very good manners applied to the wrong situation. She was brilliant, thorough, and genuinely committed to advancing cross-species biological knowledge, all of which I respected. She was also someone who, in my observation over 3 years of working on the same station, had a tendency to organize her attention around the phenomenon first, and the person inside the phenomenon second. This was a tendency I had watched from a careful distance, and it was the source of the only significant professional disagreement I had ever had with her, over a Karath patient 2 years prior whose case had become research adjacent in ways the patient had not been fully prepared for. She arrived at Bay 4 mid-morning with 2 research technicians, and a portable deep tissue scanning array that I had not been consulted about bringing to the ward. I was present when she arrived. Dale Marsh was sitting up in bed, reading his data card again. He looked up when Director Morin came in with her team. His expression registered awareness without alarm. He catalogued what he was seeing the way a person catalogues a space they have learned to read without reacting to. "Mr. Marsh," Director Morin said. She introduced herself and explained that the overnight scan had shown unusual readings and that she would like to run additional imaging. "Sure," he said. He set the data card on the bedside surface. "What kind of unusual?" "Accelerated tissue repair, significantly outside the documented range for human biology." He considered this without visible concern. "Is that a problem for me medically?" Director Morin smiled in the specific way that means a question is beside the point of what the speaker is thinking about. "It's something we'd like to understand better. May we proceed with the additional imaging?" "Go ahead," he said, and then a beat later, "I appreciate you asking." She moved to set up the scanning array. I watched him watch her, and I saw him note the way I had noted it, that she had not registered the second thing he said, had absorbed only the consent and moved forward. It was a small thing, that sentence. He had offered it without any particular weight, but the fact that it had gone past her, and that he had noticed it going past, was something I was aware of in the room the way you are aware of a change in air pressure before weather arrives. What the deep tissue scanning array showed over the following 2 hours was beyond what Havel-On's preliminary report had suggested. The fracture sites were not merely showing active calcification. The calcification density had increased by a measurable percentage even in the 3 hours between Havel-On's morning scan and Director Morin's deep tissue imaging, and the density readings were now exceeding the surrounding intact bone structure. Not matching it, exceeding it. The repair tissue was denser and more structurally organized than the uninjured bone adjacent to the break sites. One of Director Morin's technicians said, in a voice he had worked to keep flat, that this presented a theoretical problem for their standard comparative data sets because the reference values for human bone density in the medical literature did not have an upper bound commensurate with what they were seeing, since the upper bound had been assumed to be the natural density of healthy, uninjured bone. The soft tissue around the rib sites and the thoracic wall told a similar story. The bruising was resolving in ways that none of the three of us present, Havel-On had joined us by that point, could match against any existing record. The tissue was not simply recovering to its pre-injury state, it was reorganizing. The cellular architecture in the impacted areas was forming denser, more regular structural patterns than the baseline scan had shown. His temperature was elevated above his own intake baseline, not into the range I would call fever and within human norms, but measurably higher. He was generating more heat than on intake. The metabolic activity markers in his blood work, which I had taken a fresh sample of that morning, were significantly above his own baseline as well. His body was burning resources with the intensity of a system engaged in major repair work, and it was doing so smoothly, without apparent distress, without the markers of inflammatory crisis that would normally accompany this level of tissue reconstruction. Director Morin conducted her examination of the data with the focused attention of someone who has encountered the thing she has been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. I had seen that expression on her face before. It was not uncommon in research-oriented physicians when a case became genuinely interesting, and I watched it carefully. There is a version of that expression that includes the person in the room. There is a version that doesn't. Outside the bay, in the corridor, she was direct with Havel-On and her technicians. I was present because I was the ward nurse assigned to the case, and I was not going to absent myself from a discussion about my patient. She outlined what the data showed. She proposed a structured 48-hour observation protocol with documentation across multiple biological systems, tissue sampling at 6-hour intervals, and a formal research flag to the Compact Medical Research Coordination Office that would initiate the process of enrolling the case in the cross-species biological deviation database. With his consent, I said. She looked at me, of course. Has he been told what the data shows? I intend to discuss it with him now. I'd like to be present for that conversation, I said, because I was the ward nurse assigned to the case, and my presence was clinically appropriate, and for no other reason I was going to state out loud. She agreed, which was the right answer, and we went back into Bay 4 together. Director Morin explained the findings to him clearly and in reasonable clinical language, without being either falsely reassuring or needlessly alarming. She was good at this part, the communication of complex findings to patients. She told him that his tissue repair metrics were significantly above documented human norms, and that the station's research division would very much like to conduct additional observation and documentation of the process over the next 48 hours. What happens to the data? He asked. She explained the research documentation process. He listened, and then he asked whether his name would be attached to the data and where that data would go. She explained compact medical privacy protocols. He listened to that as well, with the particular quality of attention he brought to things he was assessing rather than simply receiving. I'd like some time to think about it, he said. An hour if that's workable. Director Morin gave him the hour. As the door closed behind her, I heard the low cadence of her voice already beginning to describe the observation protocol to her technicians. I came back in at the 40-minute mark. Not for a clinical reason, technically, though I had a clinical reason ready if I needed one. I came back because 40 minutes is a reasonable amount of time to sit alone with a decision that has institutional weight behind it, and I had been in those situations myself. The kind where a significant entity is waiting for your answer, and the weight of that waiting is its own kind of pressure. And I knew that the presence of someone who was not adding to the weight was sometimes useful in a way that was hard to articulate but real. He was looking at the ceiling. "Nurse Rin," he said, without looking at me. He tracked the room by hearing rather than sight, I had noticed. An old habit, probably. The kind that gets built in environments where you don't always want to be seen looking. "How are the ribs?" I asked. "Quieter than they should be, I'm starting to understand." The same faint, dry register, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Is Director Morin going to be difficult if I say no?" I considered how to answer. Honestly was the obvious answer, but honestly also required thinking about what honest meant in the context of a professional relationship with a senior colleague. "Director Morin is committed to the research value of your case," I said. "She will not be unprofessional. She will find it difficult to accept." He nodded, looked at the ceiling. "The military medic," he said after a moment. "The one who told me I healed fast. You asked earlier about prior medical encounters. That was the one I was thinking of when I said the concussion cleared faster than it should have." He ran some preliminary scans on his own time after normal rounds because he was curious. He didn't put anything in my service record. "Why not?" I asked him not to. And he agreed to that. He did. A pause. He was a good man. He thought. Dale Marsh stopped for a moment, finding the words. He thought that whatever was happening in my biology was mine, that I had the right to decide what to do with the information before anyone else got to have an opinion about it. I stood very still. The environmental system hummed in the walls. Somewhere down the corridor a door opened and closed. "The thing he said to me," Dale Marsh said, "was that the data is interesting but the person is the patient. He said those two things should not get confused." I had thought something very close to that same thing, in different words, 2 years ago when the Karath patient's case had become research adjacent. I had not said it as well. "I need to tell you something," I said. "Director Morin has submitted a preliminary research flag on your case to the Compact Medical Research Coordination Office. This is standard protocol when a case presents significant biological deviation. She is not required to obtain your consent before filing the preliminary flag. The flag initiates a review process. If you remain a patient here beyond 72 hours, a Compact Research liaison will be notified and will have the right to formally request access to your case documentation." He was quiet, looking at the ceiling, with the stillness of someone who is not surprised and is doing the work of deciding what to do with the information rather than the work of absorbing the shock of it. "A research hold," he said. "They can request a research hold if I'm still here." "Yes." And at that point, the decision about my data moves out of my hands. "The process has significant protections for patient autonomy," I said, because that was true. "But yes, at that point it becomes significantly more complex to decline participation." He turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were dark, steady, and carrying a quality that I had been noticing since intake without finding the right classification for. They were the eyes of someone who had spent a long time paying attention to things that most people don't pay attention to, and who had learned that the information gathered from that kind of attention was worth protecting carefully. "What would you do," he asked, "if you were the one making this decision?" I have thought about what it cost me to answer that question honestly. Not a great deal in the end because the answer was clear to me, but it costs something, and I want to be precise about what. "I would leave today," I said, "before the 72-hour window." He looked at me. Your injuries, I said, do not require continued inpatient care. The fractures are healing faster than I have ever documented, but healing is a favorable clinical trajectory. The soft tissue trauma is resolving. You are ambulatory, cognitively oriented, and not in acute distress. There is no medical basis for mandatory retention. I paused. I can write a discharge summary that accurately reflects your clinical condition and your decision to decline extended observation. I can write it in a way that is clinically sound and professionally defensible. And Director Morin's flag. Lapses on discharge. You are no longer a patient of record, and the review process has no subject. I looked at him directly. I would need to write the discharge documentation carefully. But everything I would write would be true. He sat up slowly, managing his own movement with the practiced care of someone who has a long history of injuries and has learned how to be in a damaged body without making it worse. He swung his legs over the side of the observation bay and sat looking at me from there, and I had the experience, unusual for me, because I am not generally given to this kind of perception in a clinical setting, of being seen in the way I had been watching him be seen, not assessed for usefulness, assessed for honesty. You'd be protecting me, he said, a patient you've known for 14 hours. I would be fulfilling my obligation to your well-being, I said, which includes the right to decline research participation and the right to discharge when your clinical condition permits it. That's carefully put. I am a careful person. Something shifted in his expression, in the way things shift when a person encounters a quality they were not certain they would find and finds it. It was not gratitude exactly, though it was not entirely separate from gratitude. It was the expression of a man who had spent a long time in institutional contexts, the military, the compact, medical facilities, where the people in positions of authority generally organized their care for him around what was useful to the institution, and who was encountering, in a small observation bay on a mid-level medical station, someone organizing their care around what was useful to him. All right, he said. It took me 90 minutes to write the discharge documentation. I was thorough, because thoroughness was my protection and his. I documented his clinical presentation at intake. I documented the overnight scan findings in the clinical terms they required: accelerated tissue repair, fracture healing progressing, without specifying the quantitative extent of the deviation, because the quantitative documentation of research-relevant findings beyond clinical necessity was at my professional discretion and not required by discharge protocol. I documented his expressed wish to decline extended observation, his clinical stability, and his capacity to make informed decisions about his own care. I documented the discharge instructions: outpatient closure strip replacement in 5 days, return if respiratory symptoms develop, follow up with a general practitioner within 2 weeks. Everything I wrote was true. I did not falsify a single data point. I simply wrote the document in the register of clinical care rather than the register of research documentation. And those are different registers. And the difference between them in this case was the difference between a file that would be used to serve him and a file that would be used to serve Director Morin's research agenda. Director Morin came to the chart room while I was completing the summary. She was professionally even. She always was. I understand Mr. Marsh has asked about discharge, she said. His clinical condition permits it, I said. He's declining extended observation. The preliminary research flag. Lapses on discharge, I said. Per protocol. Nurse Wren. She sat down across from me with the deliberateness of someone who has decided to make an argument rather than simply assert a position, which meant she was taking me seriously, which I appreciated. What we observed in that bay over 14 hours is medically significant in a way that goes beyond one patient's preferences. The data we could gather in an ethical, consent-based 48-hour protocol would advance our understanding of human biology in ways that could benefit. I understand, I said, and I agree with you about the scientific significance. If Mr. Marsh had consented to extended observation, I would have supported the protocol fully and been glad of it. Did you advise him on his options? I informed him of the procedural timeline, I said, that the preliminary flag would initiate a formal review process after 72 hours. That is clinical information relevant to his situation as a patient, and I am obligated to provide it. She looked at me for a long moment. Did you advise him to decline? I met her eyes. I answered a direct question he put to me about what I would do in his situation. I said, he is a competent adult patient with the right to make informed decisions about his own care. Answering his questions is my function. He might have consented if you hadn't. He might have, I said. And that would have been his decision, as declining is his decision. I gathered the discharge documentation into the appropriate file. The discharge stands. She left the chart room without another word. I understood her frustration. The data in Bay 4 was genuinely significant, and a part of me, the part that had been a nurse for 11 years and had learned to love the strangeness of biology, would have found the extended observation fascinating. But that part of me was not the part that discharged patients. The part that discharged patients had a clearer hierarchy. He was dressed and waiting in the observation corridor when I brought him the paperwork. He had his jacket on worn civilian-grade fabric, dark, gone soft at the elbows with extended use. His data card was in his jacket pocket. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who had come to a medical station with injuries and was leaving with those injuries well on their way to resolving, which was the appropriate outcome of a medical visit. He signed the discharge paperwork, and I explained the outpatient instructions and the follow-up timeline. He listened with the same attentive quality he brought to everything, and I had the thought, not for the first time, that whatever else was happening in his biology, his mind worked with the same patient precision, the same thorough attention to what was actually being said rather than what he expected to hear. The closure strip on the orbital laceration, I said, 5 days. Any qualified outpatient medical service. Understood. Return if you develop any respiratory symptoms, increased pain in the rib sites, or any sensation of structural instability in the shoulder. Those would be indicators that the repair process is not progressing well. I understand. He folded the discharge summary into his jacket pocket. Then he was quiet for a moment, and I thought he was going to simply say goodbye and walk out, which would have been the reasonable thing to do, and then he said, "What did you actually see in the scans?" I looked at him. He asked it the way he asked everything, directly, as a question he wanted a true answer to from a person he had assessed as likely to give one. Tissue repair at a rate I have no comparable data point for, I said. Fracture site calcification 14 hours post-injury that standard references place at 4 to 6 weeks. Soft tissue restructuring that doesn't match any baseline in our human biological database. Cellular architecture in the impacted muscle tissue forming patterns denser and more regular than the pre-injury baseline. I stopped, and then decided to continue because he had asked and deserved the full answer. Your body was not simply healing, it was rebuilding. The rebuilt tissue was denser and more structurally organized than the tissue prior to injury. The repair process appeared to be enhancing the repaired structures rather than merely restoring them. He received this in silence, looking at a point on the wall behind me, the way a person looks when they are processing something against an existing framework, fitting the new information into a structure that is becoming clearer. The military medic was right, I said. You heal fast, but that description understates what I observed by a significant margin. I've suspected, he said quietly, for a long time that there was more to it. He looked at me. I didn't want to know officially, because official knowing has consequences. I understand that, I said. Do you think it gets more pronounced, with age or with repeated injury? I don't have longitudinal data, I said honestly. One night scans and a discharge summary. What I can tell you is that every metric I observed was trending in a direction I would characterize as favorable. I looked at him and made the decision to say the last thing because it was true and because he had asked honest questions and deserved honest answers. Your body appears to be extraordinarily good at surviving damage, better than anything I have documented in 11 years of nursing in this ward. The repair process I observed was not merely accelerated, it was adaptive. It was rebuilding the damaged structures in a way that appeared to account for the injury event, to build against recurrence. A pause. That is not a thing I have language for in the standard clinical vocabulary, but it is what the data showed. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at the middle distance with the particular quality of attention that people bring to something they have known in their bones for a long time, something they have been carrying without official confirmation, and that they are now receiving confirmation of. Not surprise, exactly. More like the release of a specific tension, the tension of not knowing whether you are right, resolved into the quieter weight of knowing that you are. The medic who kept quiet, he said finally. I've thought about him over the years, whether I made the right call asking him to let it go. What do you think now? He looked at me. I think it depends on the person holding the information, he said, what they do with it. A pause. I think I was right about most of them. I understood what the qualifier meant, and did not need him to say it more plainly. Take care of yourself, Mr. Marsh, I said. He looked at me for a moment with that same steady, dark-eyed attention, and something in it was warmer than it had been, not dramatically, not in a way that was performed or excessive, but genuinely warmer, the warmth of someone who has encountered something they did not entirely expect, and is choosing to acknowledge it without making it into more than it is. I will, he said, and then, thank you, Nurse Wren, for the information and for the other thing. It was clinically appropriate, I said. Carefully put, he said, the same phrase he had used earlier. And this time, there was something at the corner of his expression that was the closest thing to a smile I had seen from him, brief and unhurried, and then he turned and walked down the observation corridor toward the station exit. I watched him go. I watched him walk steadily, without favoring the left side in the way a man with 2 fractured ribs from yesterday evening should favor it, and the corridor absorbed him, and then he was gone. I went back to the chart room. I filed the discharge documentation. I wrote a brief professional note to Havel on explaining the discharge and the clinical basis for it. I did not write a note to Director Morin because the discharge documentation was self-explanatory, and I had already said what I needed to say to her in the chart room. She had not come back to speak to me again, which told me she was processing the outcome in the private way that serious professionals process outcomes they disagree with, not through confrontation, but through the quiet work of revising her assessment of the nurse she had thought she understood. I thought she would revise it accurately. She was too intelligent to settle for an inaccurate assessment. Then I sat for a while before beginning the rest of my shift, not for any clinical reason. Simply because the last 18 hours had contained more that was worth thinking about than most of my recent months in the ward. And I have learned, over 11 years, that the time you don't give to thinking about something important is time that comes out of other accounts you were not planning to draw from. The ward outside the chart room was doing what the ward always does in the afternoon, the half-quiet that follows the morning's activity, the sounds of equipment running its cycles, the murmur of colleagues on the far end of the corridor, the occasional voice from a patient's room. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of work continuing in the way that work continues when the specific event that has just happened in it is absorbed into the general record and becomes part of the past. I thought about what I had watched happen in a human body over 14 hours. I thought about the bioscan numbers and what they implied. Not just about Dale Marsh's particular biology, but about what it might mean for human biology as a category, if his case was an outlier or a data point on a distribution that no one had been mapping, because no one had had cause to look. 12 years in the compact infantry, healing fractures faster than they should have healed, clearing concussions in 36 hours when the standard expectation was 72 to 120. One case, noted by one medic, kept off the record at a patient's request. I did not know how many other cases there had been. I did not know whether there were others like him, or whether he was genuinely singular. What I knew was that he had been carrying this alone for a long time, without institutional support and without official documentation, and that he had made a rational decision about what kind of attention he could afford to have and had organized his life accordingly. That was not a small thing. It was the kind of decision that costs something to maintain over years, the constant awareness of a distinction between yourself and the standard, the consistent management of how much of that distinction becomes visible to people who have authority over your situation. He had managed it with a composure I found, on reflection, extraordinary. Not just the composure of the intake, the 40-minute wait, the cooperation, the thank you for the closure strip. The composure in the conversation in Bay 4, when the weight of what Director Morin's research protocol would mean for him had been entirely clear, and he had still been thinking slowly, asking direct questions, looking for the honest answer rather than the reassuring one. That was the composure of someone who had spent years in situations with higher stakes than this one, and had learned to do his thinking in the middle of them rather than after. The veterinary medical tradition has a term. I have no adequate translation for it in trade language, and most trade language approximations lose the precision of what it describes. That refers to the state of encountering a fact that is larger than your existing framework for understanding it. Not ignorance, not confusion. Something more specific than either of those. The particular intellectual and perceptual experience of recognizing that the framework you have been using is simply too small for what you are looking at, and that the correct response is not to reduce the fact to fit the framework, but to enlarge the framework to accommodate the fact. The term implies effort. It implies that the enlargement is work, and that the work is worth doing. I had been a ward nurse for 11 years. I had approached every biological deviation from baseline with flat professional attention, note it, measure it, report it, proceed. That approach had served me well and would continue to serve me well for most of what I encountered in this ward. But I had encountered, in Observation Bay 4, something that the flat professional approach was not large enough to hold. Not because the data was unknowable. It was very knowable. I had documented it carefully. But because the data was attached to a person who had spent 12 years in the compact infantry healing faster than he should have, who had asked a medic to let it go because he had understood something about what happened to interesting things when institutions got hold of them, and who had sat in the observation corridor with 2 fractured ribs from yesterday, and agreed to tell me what he had seen, and asked me what I thought with the same quality of direct, patient honesty he had brought to everything from the intake forms to the discharge paperwork. The data was remarkable. The person was something different from remarkable. The person was the reason the data mattered at all. And the distinction between those two things, the phenomenon and the person, was, I had decided, the most important clinical judgment I was likely to make in any case, not which was more interesting, but which came first. I thought about that military medic, unnamed, who had run scans on his own time and then kept quiet about them, because a patient had asked him to, and he had decided that the patient's right to his own biology was worth more than the research value of what he had found. The medic who had said that the data is interesting, but the person is the patient, and those two things should not get confused. He had kept them unconfused, at professional cost that I could only estimate. I hoped he was somewhere good. I hoped he had stayed the kind of doctor he had been in that moment. 3 months later, a message arrived through the station's patient communication channel. No subject line, 3 sentences. The ribs are fine, the shoulder is fine, I wanted you to know. I read it twice. It was the exact economy of language I would have expected from him. Nothing performed, nothing unnecessary. The information delivered clearly and completely and then stopped. Not an expression of gratitude, which would have been excessive, and not the absence of gratitude, which would not have been accurate. Simply a man who had thought it was worth telling me that he was all right, because I had been the one who made sure he was the one who got to decide what all right meant for him. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it was enough. I sat with it for a while. Then I created a file in my personal archive, not in the station medical system, but in the private record I have kept for 11 years of cases that have asked me to think differently about something I thought I already understood. I labeled the file, things that were larger than the framework. I have added to it twice since then. Not because I collect unusual cases, I don't, as a rule. There are too many of them, and most of them are better served by clinical documentation than by personal archiving. I added to it because those 2 later cases asked me the same question that Observation Bay 4 had asked me, in different registers and with different data. They asked me which obligation came first, the institution's interest in the phenomenon, or the person's right to the phenomenon being theirs. I have answered that question the same way each time. I expect I will keep answering it the same way. The framework is large enough for that now. I made it that way. It was worth the work.